Grace and peace. I'm Brian Musser, the Baptist campus minister here at Drexel University, and this is Peace and Power Bible Study. The peace of Jesus Christ to change your life, the power of the Holy Spirit to change the world. And we are beginning a brand new study series with this video, and we're going to be looking at the book of Amos. Um, Amos is one of the minor prophets, one of the 12 in the Old Testament, and it may be the first written prophet. There were other prophets before Amos, but none of them kind of recorded down their prophecies in a book like Elijah or Elisha. We know about them from the narratives, not necessarily from their books of prophecy. And we're going to be talking about and taking the theme of Amos from 524, let justice roll, how the righteousness of God and societal justice interact with each other as we watch Amos prophesy about the downfall of Israel. Amos, kind of using the tagline, a shepherd who cares about the righteousness of God. This is week 1, and this is going to be introductory week. We're going to be talking about the prophet himself, and this week we're going to be looking at the who, the when, and the where more than anything else. We'll just be doing a couple selected verses from Amos, starting with the first 2 verses. Amos 1, 1 through 2. The words of Amos, who was one of the sheep breeders from Tekoa, what he saw regarding Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and Jeroboam, son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. He said, "The Lord roars from Zion and raises his voice from Jerusalem. The pastures of the shepherds mourn, and the summit of Carmel withers." So just looking at this sort of thing is interesting to note that a sheep breeder, sometimes translated shepherd, is actually a different word than the word shepherd down in the bottom. And we think it's more like somebody who was not just an employed shepherd, but someone who owned and managed multiple flocks, or maybe, was kind of a networker or a seller of sheep or something like that. We're not quite sure what that word means. Has to do with sheep, but it's more than just a shepherd. Let's put this in a timeline. We have 2 kings mentioned here, and looking at that, King Uzziah, also known as Azariah, ruled Judah from 785 BC to 733 BC. That's about 52 years that he ruled. Now, there's some interesting parts with the kings as they're mentioned in the chronology of the Bible. They quite often have co-regencies that are not explicitly explained, so there'll be some overlapping dates here. But Jeroboam II, who is the one mentioned in this passage, ruled Israel from 788 to 747 BC, and that was 41 years. Now think about that. You have 2 kings ruling for multiple decades. That is going to be a very, very peaceful and established time. This is consistent monarchies point to the fact that they are not being replaced or overthrown or just any other sort of way that kings get removed. So the fact that we have both Judah and Israel with long-standing monarchies at this time is a comment on to what is actually the peace and prosperity of the region at that time. During the time of Amos, both Syria and Egypt were experiencing some inner turmoil or some reactions from other borders, and were not very actively internationally, especially in the area around Israel and Judah. So this was actually a very peaceful and prosperous time for both of these countries. Now, just put this in perspective, the kingdom split around 930 BC under Solomon's son of Rehoboam. That is about at least 150 years before either of these 2 kings ruled, and maybe 200 years before they stopped ruling. Jeroboam, who is not related to Jeroboam II, established worship at Dan and Beersheba soon after the split. So there was an established difference in worship starting about 930 BC in Israel than was done in Judah. And this is key because Amos is from Judah, but he's prophesying about the religious practices in Israel. Ultimately, the northern kingdom of Israel would be destroyed by the Assyrians in 722. So, about 50 years after this, the northern kingdom of Israel ceases to exist. But Judah would last until the Babylonians in 586. So that's just kind of getting you the perspective of where it is. It's a prosperous time with long-standing monarchs, but they have been two independent nations for a significant amount of times. Nations that actually sometimes fought each other, but they had a sense of an identity, 150 years of identity as separate countries. Now, this is an interesting phrase in that passage we looked at, 2 years before the earthquake. So these are words and visions that came 2 years before the earthquake, but obviously it was written after the earthquake. So this was written after the earthquake about events that happened before the earthquake, which is interesting because they list King Uzziah of Judah first. Although this was spoken to Israel, it could have been written with Judah as the audience, but it was written and spoken with a gap in between the two. And because this earthquake is mentioned, we can almost pinpoint the time, someplace between 765 and 760. We have archaeological evidence of a major earthquake around the city of Hazor in this region. So that is the major earthquake that we know about. And this was such a big deal, this earthquake that happened, that Zechariah 14:5 mentions it, even though that was written 250 to 300 years after the event. You will flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. So this earthquake that Amos references, which is 2 years 2 years after the events of the book of Amos, but someplace before Amos was written, is a major temporal marker in the world of the Israelites and the Jews, the Judahites. Okay. We have a few more details about who Amos is coming up in chapter 7. These are verses 12 through 15. Then Amaziah said to Amos, "Go away, you seer. Flee the land of Judah. Earn your living and give your prophecies there, but don't ever prophesy at Bethel again, for it is the king's sanctuary and a royal temple." So Amos answered Amaziah, "I was not a prophet or the son of a prophet. Rather, I was a herdsman, and I took care of sycamore figs. But the Lord took me from following the flock and said, 'Go, prophesy to my people Israel.'" Some interesting things to note. So here we see that Amos was from Judah, but prophesying to Israel. Israel had a long established king, a long established worship processes. We also notice that Amos, although is identified as a prophet in this passage, a prophet and a seer, he is a herdsman. He's a shepherd or a sheep breeder or whatever, that kind of thing. That is who he is. That is how he identifies. It is not as he was not primarily a prophet. He was called out of the work occupation into this thing of prophecy. Now, I kind of put up a map here to help us. And this might be a little unusual to you because I've oriented it differently than what we normally see. North wasn't as big of a deal in ancient times as it is today. So, to tell you the truth, when Israel talks about their geography, they would say actually, let's do this way, from Dan to Beersheba. That was how the entire nation of Israel, both Israel and Judah, were a thing. And they would keep Dan on this side, Beersheba on that side, and it would be looking at this map. You see Dan up on, I don't know, the left, Beersheba always all the way down on the right. We have this border between Israel and Judah. You can see Tekoa on the map where Amos is from, and probably Bethel is where he's prophesying at. The one thing about this map that's kind of a little bit mentally geographically kind of different is that would not be a solid line between Israel and Judah. That's not how countries worked at this time. That's not how nations kind of figured things out. There would be these cities, and then the land or the cities would be part of the country, and then the land around the cities would be part of the country. But then the farther and farther you got away from these cities, the less it really mattered what country there was. There weren't these hard borders. They're more kind of just, it was a open set sort of way to look at countries and nations. Cities would unify into a country, and the land that they controlled would be part of that country. But you would get to places within a country that really had nothing much to do with that nation, and there wasn't kind of like a border between those two. Those borders weren't as solid as they are today. So we will come back to this map quite a bit, but this is kind of how Israel and Judah thought of themselves. Mediterranean was to their backs, across the Jordan was in front of them, Dan was to the left, and Judah and Beersheba was to the right, and that's the way they kind of saw their world. Now some kind of discussion questions, and we're going to think through some of these, but maybe some of these are a little bit less. You can drop any answers you have down in the comment section below. How would you feel if someone from a neighboring country that was sometimes your enemy and you actually fought wars with started preaching about how you should be worshiping based on a shared history from 150 to 200 years ago? What would your reaction to Amos coming from Judah to Israel, coming from another country to yours, coming from a different worship styles to yours, preaching about how you should worship a God that is somewhat related to your style of worship, but in a different way? Also, this idea is because it was such a calm time, Amos was prophesying during economically prosperous times. How do you think that would affect the reception of his message? Quite often we think that God, when we are feeling blessed, we think that God is on our side. When we are feeling cursed, when things are hard, we start looking for how do we appease God. But they were being prosperous and peaceful, and yet Amos came with a message that they weren't worshiping God right. And then the last one, what are some implications of the fact that Amos was not professional clergy, that he was a shepherd called by God to prophesy to Israel outside of his normal occupation? I throw that in there, and that would be a great conversation to have. Drop those comments in the discussion. If that is something you want to talk about, I just got done an entire series on this idea of work and faith, worship, putting work back into worship. There are 10 lesson Bible study on the intersection between our faith and our work. You can find those websites in the comments below. As always, there are 2 ways to join: live Monday night, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time via Zoom, or these weekly wrap-ups, which are posted on YouTube and my WordPress blog. I'm all over the social media: Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, WordPress, YouTube. Those links are in the descriptions below as well. I enjoyed starting this conversation with you. I hope we have a wonderful time journeying through the book of Amos together.